How are you? What's your name?
I'm Paul.
Paul. My name is Dorothy.
Nice to meet you, Dorothy.
Nice to meet you. And your name? David. Nice to meet you, David. It's nice to be here among you all. Goodness sakes. And what's your name?
Susan.
Susan. I'm Dorothy.
Ann.
Ann, nice to meet you. All these bright, smiling faces sitting here. What are you all doing in here? It's beautiful outside. So what are you doing in here? Waiting for me. Oh, you know, that reminds me of a story. I should introduce myself. I'm Dorothy Day. And, oh, thank you. I got a call from the heavenly realm. Most of you may know this, but I died in 1980. So it would be unusual for me to be here, right? But I got a call from the heavenly realm, and they wanted to know, they said that they got a call from a request from Chris Palouche, something like that. Poget. Is Chris Poget here? Oh, there she is. Well, they asked if I would come and visit you today, that apparently you've had a conference all weekend, and so could I come and tell my story? So I've been given a brief time to sojourn, so to speak, here on earth again. But I was going to tell you a story. And one time I was invited to the home of this lovely little family, and they wanted me to come and have dinner with them. And when I arrived, they had a little boy about 4 or 5 years old. And when I arrived, they introduced me to him, and he immediately burst into tears. And his mother said, "Honey, what's wrong? What is wrong?" And he said, all day, all I've heard is Dorothy Day's coming, Dorothy Day's coming. And now she's here, and she ain't nothing but an old lady. So you all may be thinking that same thing. You've been waiting for Dorothy Day to come, and here I am, and she ain't nothing but an old lady. I would hope that that's a compliment in many ways, to be able to live to be 83 years old. So I brought along some notes to kind of keep. I was known to be tangential when I started talking, and so I brought along some notes to kind of keep me focused. I see I brought along a whole bunch of notes. But you know, 83 years is a long time to live, and so I'll see what I can get through here. You know, old ladies like to talk about themselves. Are there any old ladies here who like to talk about themselves? You understand then. So this may take me a time, but they'll call me back when it's time for me to leave. So I brought some notes. Let's see what's in my bag. I brought my missal. Now, I attended Mass daily, when I could anyway. And when I traveled, I always took my missal with me so that I had the prayers of the Mass with me. I brought along my scriptures. My scriptures were very, very important to me. Sometimes I'd get crotchety. Are there any old ladies here who get crotchety? So you understand? So I'd get crotchety, and I'd be in the dining room, and I just was not loving anybody. And so I'd take myself upstairs to my room, and I'd open my scriptures, and I'd just start reading until I remembered why I was doing what I was doing and what I had been called to do. So I always carried my scriptures. I brought along a couple of books that I wrote. From Union Square to Rome. This is the story of my conversion. I wrote it for my youngest brother, John, who really could never understand why I had decided to join a church, and particularly the Catholic Church. I wrote this because I wanted people to know that my coming to God, my wanting to follow God, was because there was so much joy and love in my life, not because things were bad. And I understand a lot of people will come to God out of very, very difficult times, but I wanted people to know that I had learned the beauty and the love that was around us, and that's what brought me to God. So I wrote that book for that reason. Oh, and then this is Loaves and Fishes, which is the story of the houses of hospitality. And it's full of amazing things about what we did. And it's pretty interesting. I wrote, in a world of hates and fears, we can look to Peter Maurin's words for the liberation that love brings. Voluntary poverty is the answer. We cannot see our brother in need without stripping ourselves. It is the only way we have of showing our love. So it's still in print if you want to read it. And then I brought along my autobiography, The Long Loneliness. I wrote this in 1952. Look how young I look on this cover. My goodness. So maybe I'll read something from here. We'll just kind of see how things go. Let's see. Oh, yes, I brought along my coffee. I always carried my instant coffee with me. I loved my coffee. And so sometimes I'd be in places where there wasn't any coffee, so I always carried it. And I have a mug with me. But I have a sense that maybe there's real coffee here today. Is that right? Could somebody get me a cup of real coffee? Okay, thank you very much. So while she's doing that, no, just black. Just black. So let me see what I've got here. Where should I start? I guess I should start maybe at the beginning. I was born in 1897 in Brooklyn, New York, into a family where there was very little religion. My father had a big Bible that sat on the coffee table, but I don't remember seeing him read it very much. My mother had been baptized in Episcopalian, but we didn't go to church. When I wrote The Long Loneliness, I tried to look back as to where did I first meet God? And a couple of things came to mind. One was we moved from Brooklyn to the California. Oh, thank you, dear. Thank you. What is your name? Rosalind. Beautiful name. Thank you. You all have your coffee? Or you've already had it? Very good. So anyway, we moved to, my father got a job my father was a journalist, and he got a job at a newspaper in San Francisco. And so we moved there, and we lived in a furnished house in Berkeley for a little while we were waiting for our furniture to come. And what I remember is one day my sister Della and I were outside playing. We were making calla lily dolls. Does anybody know? Have you ever made calla lily? Do you know what calla lilies are? So calla lily dolls, you take the calla lily blossom and turn it upside down and take a rosebud and put it through the top. And so the blossom of the calla lily is the skirt and the rosebud is the head. We were making calla lily dolls and perfume. We were crushing flowers in our hands and mixing it with water and making perfume. Sometimes I still remember the smell. And it got kind of cloudy that day, and we went inside. And we weren't allowed in the attic. That's where all the personal belongings of the people who owned the house were kept. I wasn't one to follow rules all the time. And so we went up to the attic. I said to Della, let's go up. And we went up, and I found this big Bible, this huge, kind of like the one my father had that sat on the coffee table. And I said to Della, let's play school. How many of you played school when you were little? How many of you were always the teacher? I was always the teacher. So I said to Della, sit down, let's play school. And I opened this Bible and I began to read, and suddenly the room was filled with a personality that I had never met before. And instinctively, somehow I knew it was God. And as I was reading, this presence was in the room there. And then I heard, Dorothy, Della, where are you? was my mother calling. And so I quickly closed the Bible. We put everything away and went downstairs and said, we're here. But when I think back, that's the first time I met God. There were a few other times there was the big earthquake in the Bay Area in 1906, I believe. And I remember 2 o'clock in the morning, my bed was shaking and moving across the room, and it was so scary. It was so dark, and my mother and my father had grabbed my brothers and my sister and gone outside, but I don't know why they had left me. And when it calmed down, I went outside and I looked across the water, and it looked like all of San Francisco was burning. And my experience from that was the first time I really experienced community. My mother didn't like Californians very much because she said they weren't very friendly, and they were kind of all to their own. But in this experience, in this occasion, people came from all over the neighborhoods and came to the parks and brought clothing and food, and everybody was helping everybody else. And we'd see boats filled with people coming across the Bay Area. Well, the newspaper where my father worked burnt down, and so we had to move to find another job, and we moved to Chicago at that time. And another experience for me with recognizing God in the world was a friend of mine who was the oldest of 8 children and had to do lots and lots of work. And at night, but she had to get all the housework done before she could play. And by the time she could play, she was just too tired. And she was about 3 or 4 years older than me. But I remember, so we would just kind of lay on the back porch and talk, and she would tell me stories. And I remember one time she told me a story about a saint. I don't remember who the saint was, but I remember being so impressed with the life that a person leads in order to become a saint, the commitment to God and the hard work and the perseverance. And so I determined right then and there that I was going to become a saint. And I would kneel by my bed, the wooden floor by my bed, and I'd pray until my knees would hurt. And Della would say, Dorothy, come to bed and tell me a story. And I would say, no, Della, get out of bed and get on your knees. We have to become saints. So those were some of the couple of other experiences that God was alive and real in the world and in my life. I believe my vocation to help the poor, or at least my first recognition of poor, was when I read Upton Sinclair's book, The Jungle. And it's all about immigrants and the horrendous working conditions in the meat plant. And it was right there in Chicago, and maybe that's why it impacted me so much. But I remember after reading it, I started asking my mother, how come there's so much injustice in the world? Why is it that there are so many people that have so little and so few people that have so much? And my mother would say, well, it's just the way it is. But I wondered about that. I thought, people like us who had been given a leg up in the world, then we ought to help others get a bit of a break. I would take my youngest brother, John, who was born when I was 14, very much, he was almost like my own little boy. I would take him in his pram, and we would walk through the west side of Chicago, and I would wonder about the suffering that was going on inside the homes there, behind the doors of those homes. Always the question, why is there so much injustice? I graduated from high school at the age of 16, and I was given a scholarship to college. I went to the University of Illinois in Champaign-Urbana. And I was pretty pious in those days. I'd gone through this kind of religious experience with wanting to become a saint, and I wrote really pious letters to friends, and particularly to one friend. And so I joined this little Methodist church there, and I started attending church on Sundays, and I just, they're talking about all the social problems of the world, and I wondered, I didn't see anybody doing anything about the problems. You know, we'd read that if you've got one coat, 2 coats give one away, and I didn't see anybody doing any of that. And so I had this yearning to make the world different for the poor, and I wasn't seeing anything happening. And then one day I was walking across campus, and I saw this sign, "Workers unite, you have nothing to lose but your chains." And I thought, somebody's wanting to help the people. So I ran up to the booth, the table that they had, and it was the young communists. It was a group of young communists. And I was so impressed to find somebody who was trying to make a difference. Now I was called a communist many, many times during my lifetime. And I understand that sometimes people still say that about me. But you need to know, I never became a card-carrying communist, as they would say. But I was very sympathetic to their opinions and their viewpoints, because they wanted to make the world different, where it was easier for the poor. So I hung around with them for quite a while. Now, I promised to tell everything truthfully today, so I'll be honest with you, I didn't go to very many classes. They were rather boring, for one thing. And so I didn't go to very many classes, but I did write some articles for the newspaper, and my father was a journalist, my 2 older brothers were becoming journalists, and I thought that's the perfect thing for me to do, would be to become a journalist. Well, at the end of my 2nd year of college, my father decided to move the family back to New York. And I didn't want to stay there in Chicago by myself. I'm forgetting my coffee here. It's very good coffee. So I moved with them, and I told my father that I wanted to become a journalist. Well, my father didn't think journalism was a proper profession for a woman. And so he went to all the major newspapers and told them not to hire me. So I went to all the newspapers he didn't go to, like that were run by the Socialist Party, and I got a job with one of those newspapers with the call. They paid me $5 a week, and I wrote about war resistance and bread riots and various things like that. This was quite a time in my life. It was, excuse me, I picked up a cough on my way down here. Oh, my mind is just going so full right now of memories of that time. I remember that there was a whole group of us that were really good friends, Mike Gold and some other people, and Eugene O'Neill. You've probably heard of Eugene O'Neill. And so we would gather in this bar, and there was a back room at the bar, and we called it the Hell Hole. And we would hang out there until the wee hours of the morning. And, you know, nobody ever wanted to go home. Nobody ever really wanted to go to bed. Nobody wanted to be alone. And so we'd stay there. I could outdrink most of them. And I would go from table to table singing Frankie and Johnny Were Lovers. That was such an amazing time. And it was the first time I ever, you know, Francis Thompson's wonderful poem, The Hound of Heaven. Well, Eugene could recite it from beginning to end, and he'd sit there looking very black and dour and his head hanging down in his chest, and just recite this poem from beginning to end. And the poem fascinated me because I knew that at some point I was going to have to encounter that the beginning of my life, but particularly the end of my life. I would often, many early mornings, I would have to walk Gene O'Neill home to his room because he was too drunk to get there on his own. And I would tuck him into bed and refuse his invitations to join him. And then I would walk back to my room. And as I walked back to my room, I walked past St. Joseph Catholic Church there in Greenwich Village. And I would see people going into the church at early morning, before 6 a.m. for the early morning mass. They were going to pray before they started their day. And so sometimes I would slip into the back of the church and I'd sit in one of the way back pews and I would watch what was going on, and I envied the faith of those people. And there was something very sacred happening up front. I didn't understand it or even know what to call it, but I was aware of this sacredness. And I suppose we could say that it was at that time that the seeds of my Catholic faith were planted. Following that, I became a nurse and went to work in a hospital, and I met a man named Lionel, and I fell in love. Lionel and I became lovers, and I moved in with him. This next part is always really hard to talk about. But I found out I was pregnant. And I told Lionel, I didn't tell anybody for some time, but I told Lionel finally that I was going to have a baby. And Lionel said, "Get rid of it. Get rid of it or I'll leave." I did not want to do that, but I loved Lionel, and I didn't want Lionel to leave. And so Lionel made an appointment for me with a doctor and told me he'd pick me up later. And I had that much regretted abortion. And the doctor and I waited and waited for Lionel to come back. And Lionel didn't. And finally, the doctor put me in a taxi and sent me to the apartment. When I arrived at the apartment, it was empty. And there was a note. It said, "I've gone to Chicago, don't follow." Here I had done something that I didn't want to do out of love. And he left anyway. I married shortly after that to an older man and was married for about a year. I wrote a novel called The 11th Virgin, an autobiographical novel in which I told it all. And I sold that novel, sold the movie rights to that novel for $5,000. Some good came from that. I bought a little cottage on Staten Island. I remember years later, after I was in the Catholic Worker, I remember being so aware of that novel and feeling so embarrassed and ashamed. And so every time I would find a copy of it, I would burn it. And I was at confession one time, and I was telling the priest how much this novel bothered me and how I wanted to burn every copy that had ever been published. And he told me, he said, "Dorothy, it's just your pride. Let it go. Get on with the work that you're supposed to do." So it was in the mid-20s. Let me cover this a minute. That I met and fell in love again. I met a man and fell in love again. I met Forster Batterham. Now, Forster was a biologist and an anarchist. And we eventually established a relationship and moved into the cottage on Staten Island. I loved Forster with everything in me. I loved the way he smelled. I loved cleaning out his pockets and finding sand and seashells and fish bait. He taught me so much. And he would, being a biologist, he knew so much about nature, and so he'd teach me about the plants, and we'd go fishing. Well, Forster would go fishing. I'd get seasick, so I'd stay on the shore. But we did so much. We long walks, and life was so beautiful. And it was then that I began to pray, just kind of spontaneously. I began to pray, and I'd walk to the village for the mail, and I would pray. I'd been given a rosary by a friend, and I knew I wasn't praying the rosary correctly, but I'd pray it anyway. I'd move my fingers over the beads, and it was like I had to pray. There was so much love and so much beauty going on in my life that I needed to say thank you. And Forster would just get so upset every time I brought up God. And I would say, but Forster, look at all this beauty and love. There has to be a source to it. And he would often just storm away. And then I discovered I was pregnant again. I really didn't think I'd ever be able to have a child. And when I told Forster, he said the same thing that Lionel said. Get rid of it. Forster didn't want to be a father. He didn't want to bring a child into the way the world was. But I had done that once, and I wasn't going to do that again. And so I carried my child. You know, it's like a biological cow. Everything was just so good and so beautiful and so wonderful. There had to be a God. There had to be a source to this. And on March 4th, 1926, my beautiful daughter, Teresa, was born. We always moved to the city during the winter because it was too cold to stay on the island. And I remember holding my child for the first time and feeling love fill the entire room. And I knew it was God's love just covering us. I sat up in bed the next day and wrote a whole article on giving birth and the miracle of giving birth for the newspaper The Masses, which was another socialist newspaper. I remember my friend Mike Gold, it got printed all across the world, apparently. My friend Mike Gold told me there were rubles waiting for me in Russia if I ever went there. And a few years later, when I was living in Mexico, I met, what's that famous artist's name? I'm losing his memory. Diego Rivera. I met Diego Rivera, and he told me that he had read about the birth of my daughter. I'd made the decision that I would have my daughter baptized, come what may, or my child, come what may. I knew that I needed to give my child a foundation that I didn't have, rather than floundering and looking for right and wrong, but I needed some direction for her. And in April, after she was born, we moved back to the island, and one day I was walking up to the village to get the mail, and I saw this sister, and she was over by the St. Joseph Children's Home, and I thought, well, I'll ask her how I can get my child baptized. So I walked up to her and I said, how can I get my child baptized? And she said, are you a Catholic? And I said, well, no, ma'am, but I want my child to be one. And she said, where do you live? And I told her. Now, I found out later that she knew exactly where I lived. She'd been walking by my house praying for me for 2 years. And so she said, well, you have to take instructions. So I will come every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 10 o'clock. Be ready. Yes, ma'am. Later I learned to say, yes, sister. And so she came. And the first time she came, she knocked at the front door. I had not told Forrester she was coming. And he opened the door. Now, this was in the days when the sisters wore the full habit. Well, you can imagine the look on his face. And he turned around and glared at me and then walked out. Sister never came to the front door again. She always would come to the side window and she'd say, "Is he here?" And if Forrester was there, he'd jump up and leave. And so Sister and I journeyed together. She became one of my dearest friends. But she kept telling me that if your daughter's going to be a Catholic, you have to become a Catholic. And so in July, we had Tamar baptized and had a wonderful lunch of fresh lobster and salad that Forrester had caught the lobster and made the salad, but he didn't stay. There were many, many arguments for the next year and a half because I knew that God was calling me to join my daughter in the Catholic Church, mostly calling me to follow him, and it would mean giving up the man that I loved and most of my communist friends. It would mean a complete change in my life. And so I put it off. I put it off for as long as I could. And in December of 1927, shortly after Christmas, the day after Christmas, we had a horrendous argument again. And Forrester stormed out. We were living in the city for the winter, and I knew I had to put an end to the way we were destroying one another. So I picked up the phone, and I made the decision I wouldn't let him back in, and I picked up the phone and called Sister, and I just said, "Sister, I'm ready." And she said, meet me at the church on the island. So I took the ferry over to the island, and I spent the night in the cottage. My heart was breaking. I knew what this meant. Forrester wouldn't marry me in a civil ceremony. He certainly wasn't going to marry me in a religious ceremony. I felt like I was in a tug of war, God on one side and Forrester on the other. I knew what I had to do. The next morning I was baptized conditionally because at some point I'd been baptized in the Episcopal Church when I was 12. I forgot to tell you about that. Father heard my confession. Sister was my godmother. I don't know if I had a godfather. I don't remember. And the next morning, I went back to Mass, Now, I'd been going to Mass a little bit and sitting in the back of the church and just watching what was going on. So I went to Mass the next morning, and when the bells rang, I went up to the communion rail and knelt down. I was the only one that went to the communion rail because it was the second time the bells rang that you were supposed to go up. And so I just knelt there pretending like I knew what I was doing and received my first communion. And thus began my journey into the Catholic Church. I moved to Culver City, California shortly after that, where I received a job I was hired as a screenwriter. And that lasted about 3 months. That was not the lifestyle for Tamar and I. And so then we went to Mexico, and I wrote articles for Commonweal magazine to support Tamar and I and on living in Mexico until Tamar contracted malaria, and then we went back to New York. I had to stay away from New York. I knew I didn't have enough strength on my own to stay away from Forrester. And so I had to stay. I couldn't be near where there would be that possibility. I wrote him long, long letters begging him to marry me, telling him how much I loved him. And when I arrived back in New York and he came to see Tamar, he had a new woman on his arm, kind of flaunting her, and that helped so much. In 1932, December of 1932, I was commissioned to go to Washington, D.C. to write an article about a hunger march. Now, the hunger march had been organized by many of my communist friends. And if you ever get a chance, just look up try to find the story of that march, because these were committed people were fighting for and working for the food for the poor and benefits for single mothers and unemployment benefits, various things like this that I was so much in favor of. And they had to wait 3 days in the rain and cold before they could even get a permit to march. But I stood there on the sidelines on December 8th, 1932, and I watched them march by, and I wanted, with everything in me, to be out there marching with them. You know, I knew I could write to raise awareness, but I wanted to do something. I felt very much that somehow when I became a Catholic that I had abandoned the poor, and so I wanted to find a way to work for them. So after the march was over and I wrote my story, I went to the Shrine of the Immaculate Conception. It was just being built. And this was on the Feast of the Immaculate Conception. And I knelt there, and with sighs and tears of longing, I begged God to show me a way that I could use my gifts to make the world a better place for the poor. And then I went back to New York. Tamar and I were sharing a small apartment with my youngest brother, John, and his wife, Tessa. And I walked into the apartment, and there was this strange little man. He introduced himself. He said his name was Peter Marin, heavy French accent. He was dressed he'd kind of dressed up for the occasion, they told me. He was dressed in a suit and a tie. Everything looked like it had been slept in, and I found out later it had been. He talked incessantly. He was the only person I ever met that you could walk up, you could be in a conversation with him, and it would get interrupted, and you'd leave, and 3 weeks later come back to him, and he could pick up the conversation right exactly in the middle of that sentence. He was just he was an inspiring man. And he told me, I want to read something to you. He told me that he often fancied himself a troubadour of the Lord. And he would write these, what we called easy essays. And this one's called Utopia, A Case for Utopia. The world would be better off if people tried to become better. And people would become better if they stopped trying to become better off. For when everyone tries to become better off, nobody is better off. But when everyone tries to become better, everybody is better off. Everyone would be rich if nobody tried to become richer, and nobody would be poor if everybody tried to be the poorest. And everybody would be what he ought to be if everybody tried to be what he wants the other fellow to be. And Peter told me that he had a plan for making the world a place where it was easier for people to be good. And he told me that we needed to have houses of hospitality where people could have a bit of community, and roundtable discussions for clarification of thought, and agronomic universities. Do you know what agronomic universities are? Farms. So we needed to have farms so the unemployed could learn to grow their own food and create cottage industries. I got really excited when he told me that we were going to spread the word about this plan of his by starting a newspaper. I was a journalist. I knew how to write. I knew how to set up a newspaper. But I said to him, but where will we get the money to have a newspaper printed? And he said, have you never read the lives of the saints? When they wanted something, they simply prayed for it. So I set up my typewriter on my kitchen table, and I began to write. Excuse me. And on May 1st, 1933, the first edition of the Catholic Worker was ready to go. I found out we could get 2,500 copies printed by the Paulist. I remember that day so well. That May 1st is the Labor Day for the Communist Party. And so we were there, and there were hundreds of thousands of communists on one side of Union Square, and there were 4 or 5 of us on the other side. And over here, the communists were selling the Daily Worker. Read the Daily Worker, read the Daily Worker. And we were over here on the other side saying, read the Catholic Worker Daily, read the Catholic Worker Daily. And we sold out. All 25. It sold for a penny a copy. In fact, it still sells for a penny a copy if you're interested. Oh, I want to read to you what I wrote for my editorial on that one. The money for the printing of the first, we had no idea what would happen and where the money would come from if we were to continue this. So we were just trusting that it would have to come from donations. But I wrote, the money for the printing of the first issue was raised by begging small contributions from friends. Excuse me. A priest in Newark sent us $10 in the prayers of his congregation. A sister in New Jersey, garbed also in holy poverty, sent us $1. Another kindly and generous friend sent $25. The rest of it, the editors squeezed out of their own earnings. And at that, they were using money necessary to pay milk bills, gas bills, electric light bills. By accepting delay, the utilities did not know they were furthering the cause of social justice. And so the Catholic Worker began. And we wrote about the social ills of the world. You know, we didn't mean to start houses of hospitality ourselves. Peter meant that every person should be involved in houses of hospitality. Every diocese should have some kind of ministry to the homeless. Every parish should have some kind of ministry to the homeless. And every home should have a Christ room where somebody could come and stay who was in need. Our first houses of hospitality were obviously the volunteers who came. Our subscriptions to the Catholic Worker plummeted. Climbed high. They plummeted later. But they climbed high in just a very few months. And so young people came, and we rented apartments. Donations came. One night, two women came and said that they'd been sleeping in the subway and reading about the houses of hospitality. And did we have a room for them? And I told them no, we didn't have any room. And they left. A week later, one woman came back. I asked her where her companion was. And she told me, when we were here last, you told us there was no room. My friend was so despondent that when we got back to the subway station, she threw herself in front of a subway train. Because I had said no, there was no room. There was a woman who was no longer alive. We had $5 in the kitty, and so the next morning, I went upstairs and said, Margaret, is there room for one more? And she said, of course, and made room. And the next morning, I went and rented an apartment. And that began the houses of hospitality. Our houses of hospitality were hard to deal with sometimes. The dining room could get quite noisy. I remember one time it was so unbelievably noisy, I just kind of had this wish for some silence. And all of a sudden, the front door threw open, and this big, tall man walked in. And he had really greasy hair, and he'd rub his hand through his head and down his dirty pants and through his head, and he said, "Shut up, everybody, or I'm going to kill you all." it got quiet. Really, really quiet. And I wondered what to do. And I looked at him. I was across the room, and I knew I had to do something. And the words, overcome evil with good, kept going through my mind. Overcome evil with good. Overcome evil with good. So I walked across the room, and I stuck up my hand, and I said, hi, my name's Dorothy. What's your name? And he looked at my hand, and he looked at his hand, and he said, my hand's really dirty. And I said, that's all right. I've been cooking all morning. My hand's full of crud. And so he stuck his hand out, and he said, my name's Fred. And I said, hello, Fred. Welcome to the Catholic Worker. Would you like some soup? Are you going to have some? And I said, I will. I'm really hungry. I'll have some soup with you. And so some people scurried around and found two places and sat us down and brought 2 bowls of soup. And I started eating my soup right away. And I'm looking at Fred, and he's just staring at my soup. And he's not eating his soup. And I said, Fred, do you want my soup? Yeah. And so I gave him my soup. And I said, and you want me to eat your soup, right? Yeah. And I realized he thought maybe somebody was trying to poison him. And I'd already started my soup. So I ate his soup. And then at some point I turned to the person next to me and started to talk. And Fred kind of growled. And I realized he just wanted my undivided attention. And so I looked back at him. And there on the table in front of us was a dinner roll. And I just reached and picked it up and broke it and handed him a piece. And he took it. You know, it's in the breaking of the bread that we know him. We ate our bread, and then I said, Fred, I have to get busy. I have to get back to the kitchen. Thank you for coming, and please come anytime. And so Fred stood up and left. The next morning, Fred showed up at the door again with 3 big bags of vegetables. And he said, these are for the soup. And Fred became a regular. You know, when anybody moved in, people would say to us, how long can they stay? And we would say, when somebody moves in their family, they stay until they're ready to go. So we wrote about the social ills in the world, and we performed the works of mercy. And the money came in, and the support came in. And then I wrote against wars. I'm a pacifist. And I'm a pacifist because I think it's the only thing we can be. Wars against the Spirit of Jesus. And being in the Spirit of Jesus is the most important thing that we need to do. It's more important than being well respected. It's more important than being well liked. It's more important than being an American. But when I began to write against the wars, our subscriptions plummeted, donations fell, and people left. But others came. I could do nothing else other than that, except to write what I thought Jesus would write. We marched with the civil rights workers in Selma, Alabama. I saw the many being beaten. I was shot at Koinonia Farms. I was arrested about 13 times for standing up for what I believe is true. You know, all we ever really wanted to do was make the rich poor and the poor holy. We just wanted to make the world a better place, as Peter would say, where it's easier for people to do good. That's all we wanted to do. I was invited to the Eucharistic Congress in 1976, and that was to speak there, and it was the most stressful talk of my entire life. They asked me to speak on women in religion, and yet women in the Eucharist, and my talk was scheduled for August 6th. It was as if nobody at the Congress recognized that August 6th, what it means to peacemakers. That's the day we commemorate the bombing of Hiroshima, and on the 9th, Nagasaki. I told Mother Teresa and my friend Eileen Egan as we walked across campus that day, it was the most difficult talk I'd ever given. And a month later, I had a heart attack. I wonder if that talk was what caused it. And then I stayed close to home after that. I should look at my notes and see where I'm headed here, because I might have just gone all the way off track here. But let me see. Oh, really? Already? It's time to come back? But I want, look at my notes. I got so much more. All right, okay, I'll be there. I'll be there. So I just want to say we picketed with people on strike. We marched with those working for civil rights. We picketed with Cesar Chavez and workers in California. In fact, that's where I was arrested the last time. I just want to close by encouraging you to keep up the work you're doing. And I want to close with the postscript from my book, The Long Loneliness. Oh, I don't want to leave any coffee. We were just sitting there talking when Peter Marin came in. We were just sitting there talking when lines of people began to form saying, we need bread. We could not say, go, be thou filled. If there were 6 small loaves and a few fishes, we had to divide them. There was always bread. We were just sitting there talking, and people moved in on us. But those who can take it, take it. Some moved out, and that made room for more, and somehow the walls expanded. We were just sitting there talking, and someone said, let's all go live on a farm. It was as casual as all of that, I often think. It just came about. It just happened. I found myself a barren woman, the joyful mother of children. It's not always easy to be joyful, to keep in mind the duty of delight. The most significant thing about the Catholic worker is poverty, some say. The most significant thing is community, others say. We're not alone anymore. But the final word is love. At times it has been, in the words of Father Soshima, a harsh and dreadful thing, and our very faith in love has been tried through fire. We cannot love God unless we love each other, and to love we must know each other. We know him in the breaking of bread. We know each other in the breaking of bread, and we're not alone anymore. Heaven is a banquet, and life is a banquet too, even with the crust, where there is companionship. We've all known the long loneliness, and we have learned that the only solution is love, and that love comes with community. It all happened while we sat there talking, and it is still going on. And so I encourage you, keep talking. Keep trying to solve the problems. Keep trying to find ways that you and those that you know and those that you love can help those who need a bit of a break. If you've been given a leg up in the world, then share it. Help others to have a little bit more. Create a world, as Peter said, where it's easier for people to do good. I thank you so much for letting me come. I'm on my way. See, I got my bag packed. I got to go. They're calling me. So thank you for letting me be here.